The wind up here didn't just blow. It tore at you, stripping away the polite veneer of the gala inside. I stood at the edge of the penthouse terrace, gripping the cold railing, listening to the gale drown out the clinking crystal and hollow laughter behind me. Then the glass door slid open. The change in air pressure hit me before I even turned. Sophia stepped out of the shadows, holding 2 flutes of champagne, looking not at the guests she was hosting, but at the bruising purple sky. She didn't ask why I was out there. She just walked to the railing, her shoulder brushing mine, and said, "Move closer. The rain's coming." My life at the firm was defined by what I didn't say. I was the fixer, the strategist in the charcoal suit who stood 3 feet behind the spotlight, ensuring the bulb never burned out. They called Sophia the visionary, the architect of the industry's most aggressive takeover. They called me, well, they didn't call me anything. They just called me when things broke. I had cultivated a specific kind of existence, a silence that felt like heavy, dark velvet. It was comfortable, expensive, and completely isolating. It wrapped around me, protecting me from the messy, chaotic noise of genuine connection. I preferred the view from the shadows. It was safer there. You could see the cracks in the foundation without ever having to worry about the roof falling on your head. But tonight, the roof felt precarious. The merger was done. The ink was dry on contracts worth more than the GDP of a small country. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of victory, which smells remarkably like stale champagne, heavy perfume, and raw, unchecked ambition. I had escaped to the balcony to breathe, to find that familiar quiet. I should have left hours ago. My car was waiting downstairs. My empty apartment was waiting across the river. Yet I remained anchored to this railing, looking out at a city that looked like a circuit board shorting out in the humidity. I told myself I was just cooling off. That was a lie. I was waiting. I was waiting for the inevitable pull, the gravity that Sophia generated simply by existing in a room. For 5 years I had watched her. I studied her the way an art forger studies a masterpiece, not to appreciate the beauty, but to understand the technique. She was unflinching. That was the word everyone used. Sophia didn't blink. She didn't hesitate. She moved through the corporate world with a terrifying precision, cutting away dead weight with a scalpel while smiling for the shareholders. Standing here now, with the wind whipping my hair across my face, I realized how little I actually knew about the woman behind the precision. Inside, she was a CEO. Out here, in the rising storm, she was just a silhouette against the lightning. The distance between us was calculated, professional, safe. But as she stood there, the stem of the champagne flute held loosely in her fingers, that distance felt charged. It felt like the split second before a wire snaps. I looked at her profile. She wasn't looking at me. She was watching the clouds churn above the skyline, her expression unreadable. Most people found her silence intimidating. I found it loud. It demanded attention. It forced you to fill the void, usually with nervous chatter or apologies. I had learned long ago to match her silence with my own. We were 2 voids standing on a precipice, and the tension between us was a physical weight. Why hadn't I left? Because the velvet silence wasn't enough anymore. Because after 5 years of watching her from the safety of the dark, I wanted, terrifyingly, to be seen. I wanted her to look away from the storm and look at me, not at the fixer, not at the employee, at me. The air grew heavy, saturated with moisture. The scent of ozone mixed with the sharp, clean fragrance of her cologne, sandalwood and something colder, like steel. It was intoxicating. It made my head spin faster than the alcohol ever could. I gripped the railing tighter, the cold metal biting into my palms. I needed to go. I needed to run back to the safety of my archives and my quiet life. But then the first drop hit. It slapped against the glass railing with a wet, heavy thud. Then another. The sky opened up, not with a gradual drizzle, but with sudden, violent intent. The wind shifted, blowing the rain directly toward us. I flinched, instinctively stepping back. Sophia didn't move. She didn't retreat. She simply turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto mine, peeling back the layers of my carefully constructed defense. The storm had arrived, and for the first time, I had nowhere left to hide. The rain didn't just fall. It drove sideways, a sudden, violent sheet that turned the city into a gray blur. The smell hit me instantly. Wet pavement, the metallic tang of ozone, and beneath it all, that sharp, decisive note of sandalwood that clung to her skin. It was a sensory overload, the kind that usually made me retreat into my head to analyze and categorize until the feeling went away. But I couldn't analyze this. The city below had disappeared, swallowed by the deluge, leaving us suspended in a gray, wet void. "I should go," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "The weather is turning and the car is downstairs." It was a weak excuse, flimsy as wet paper. I knew it. She knew it. Sophia didn't answer immediately. She took a sip of her champagne, her eyes never leaving mine. She didn't step aside to let me pass. She didn't physically block the glass doors, but she might as well have built a brick wall in front of them. She held me there, with nothing more than a look, unflinching, slightly amused, and terrifyingly direct. It was the same look she gave across the boardroom table when a competitor tried to bluff. It said, "I see your hand, and I know you're folding." "You're always leaving," she said. Her voice was low, cutting under the sound of the wind. "The deal closes, you leave. The crisis ends, you leave. The party starts, and you vanish." "I'm not paid to party," I deflected, gripping my elbows. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in 10 seconds. "I'm paid to make sure nothing breaks." "Nothing is breaking tonight," she countered. "Except maybe the weather." Then she moved. She took a single step, altering the entire geography of the balcony. She stepped under the narrow overhang where I was standing, invading the small, dry sanctuary I had claimed. The world shrank instantly. There was the glass railing behind me, the storm to my left, and Sophia in front of me. The space between us, which had been a safe, professional 3 feet, collapsed to inches. I could feel the heat radiating off her. It was shocking against the biting cold of the wind. It wasn't just body heat. It felt like the hum of a high-voltage line. She was wearing a backless silk dress that probably cost more than my first car, and a structured blazer draped over her shoulders. She looked impeccable, untouchable, while I felt windblown and frayed. "You're cold," she noted. She didn't offer me her jacket. That would have been polite. Instead, she leaned in, just a fraction, shielding me from the wind with her own body. It was a proprietary gesture, dominant and protective all at once. "Or are you just shaking?" "It's the wind," I lied. My voice sounded breathy. "Is it?" She studied me. "You're the most composed person on my payroll. I've seen you handle federal regulators without blinking. But put you on a balcony in a thunderstorm." She paused, her gaze dropping to my mouth for a heartbeat before snapping back to my eyes. "And you look like you're about to shatter." "I don't shatter," I said, finding a shred of my usual steel. "I reinforce." "Then reinforce this," she murmured. She raised her glass, the crystal catching the flicker of lightning, and took a slow sip. "Why are you really out here?" "The truth. No strategy, no spin." "I needed air," I said. "The room was loud." "The room was full of people who want things from me," she corrected. "You're the only one who never asks for anything. It makes me wonder what you actually want." The question hung there, heavier than the humidity. What do I want? I wanted to not be standing here. I wanted to be standing closer. I wanted to reach out and touch the lapel of her blazer to see if the fabric was as soft as it looked. I wanted to know if the composure was armor or skin. "I want to do my job," I said, falling back on the only safe ground I had. Sophia laughed. It was a low, throaty sound that I felt in my chest more than I heard. "Liar," she whispered. Before I could answer, the sky ripped open. A crack of thunder shook the building. The wind gusted violently, blowing rain deep under the overhang, soaking the hem of my dress and splashing against Sophia's back. The balcony was no longer untenable. It was hostile. "Inside," she commanded, not waiting for an argument. She reached out, her hand hovering near the small of my back, but not touching, guiding me toward the glass doors. The spell on the balcony broke, shattered by the sheer force of the elements, but as we stepped over the threshold, I knew the storm wasn't staying outside. We were bringing it in with us. The heavy glass door slid shut on its track, sealing the storm away with a decisive click. The roar of the wind vanished instantly, replaced by the low, expensive hum of the climate control and the muffled, rhythmic drumming of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was jarring. One second I was fighting the elements, hair whipping across my face. The next, I was standing in a vacuum. We weren't at the gala anymore. We were in the sanctuary, the private residential wing of the penthouse that the board members only whispered about. I took a breath, tasting the filtered air. The room was exactly what I expected, and that was the problem. It was stark, modern. It was a space designed for power, not comfort. The walls were sheer glass, looking out over the drowning city like a watchtower. The furniture was low, Italian leather in severe shades of charcoal and slate, arranged with mathematical precision. There were no personal photos on the mantel, no clutter on the tables, no signs of life. It was a showroom for an existence that didn't allow for mistakes. Standing there, dripping slightly onto the polished concrete floor, I felt like a chaotic smudge on a pristine lens. The lighting was unforgiving. Bright, gallery-style track lights pinned me in place, exposing every nervous tick, every shiver that hadn't stopped since the balcony. I felt examined. I felt like a line item on a budget sheet being reviewed for cuts. I crossed my arms, trying to shield myself from the glare, waiting for the dismissal. Sophia walked past me, her heels clicking sharp echoes against the floor. She didn't look at me. She moved to a sleek panel on the wall. With a single fluid motion, precision, always precision, she slid a finger down the control pad. The harsh overheads died. The room plunged into a soft amber twilight, lit only by the hidden architectural cove lighting and the erratic, strobing flashes of lightning outside. The mood shifted instantly from interrogation to something far more dangerous. It became intimate. The shadows stretched out, softening the hard angles of the room, making the space feel smaller, closer. "Better," she murmured. She walked to the center of the living area and stopped. Then she did something that made my breath hitch in my throat. She kicked off her heels. It was a small thing, a trivial thing. But for Sophia, the woman who wore armor made of silk and reputation, it was a breach of protocol so severe it felt like a confession. She let the expensive stilettos lie where they fell, sinking her bare feet into the deep pile of the area rug. She rolled her shoulders, a slow, feline stretch that cracked the facade of the CEO just enough to show the tired woman underneath. I shouldn't have been seeing this. This was backstage. This was the dressing room after the curtain fell. "Drink," she stated. It wasn't a question. She moved to a wet bar carved from a single slab of black marble. I watched her hands. They were steady. She bypassed the wine fridge, bypassed the mixers. She reached for a heavy crystal decanter filled with amber liquid. Whiskey. Neat. The choice of a closer. The sound of the glass stopper being removed was sharp in the quiet. The liquid poured with a heavy, viscous glug. Clink. The bottle hit the glass. Clink. The glass hit the marble. Every sound was amplified, echoing in the cavernous room like a gunshot. My internal risk assessment software was screaming. Red alert. I calculated the variables. Leaving now would be a snub. It would be a rejection of hospitality from the most powerful woman in my industry. It would be professional suicide. But staying? Staying was personal suicide. Staying meant stepping into the cage with the tiger and hoping it just wanted to play. "I really should check on the guests," I tried, my voice lacking any real conviction. "The guests are drunk on cheap Prosecco and self-importance," Sophia said, her back to me. "They won't miss us." She turned, holding 2 heavy tumblers. She walked toward me, barefoot now, losing 3 inches of height but gaining a terrifying amount of ground. She moved silently, the predator in her element. She stopped in front of me. The scent of the whiskey hit me first, peat and smoke, mixing with the rain still clinging to our clothes. She held out the glass. I reached for it. My hand was trembling. I hoped she wouldn't notice, but Sophia noticed everything. As I took the weight of the crystal from her, our fingers brushed. It wasn't a quick handoff. Her fingertips grazed the back of my hand, cool and dry, and lingered for a fraction of a second too long. It was a micro moment, a pause in the timeline of the universe. The contact sent a jolt up my arm that had nothing to do with static electricity. It was a current, a connection. And looking into her eyes, dark and dilated in the dim light, I knew she felt it too. She gestured toward the sofa, a sprawling, low-slung piece of Italian design, upholstered in midnight blue leather. It dominated the center of the room, a piece of furniture that cost more than my education, floating on the sea of the dark rug. We sat on opposite ends. The distance was calculated. It was the exact proximity you'd maintain during a high-stakes performance review or a deposition. Close enough to hear a whisper, far enough to deny you heard it. The leather was cool against my legs, a stark contrast to the whiskey burning a slow, golden path down my throat. I held the glass with both hands, using it as a shield, anchoring myself to the physical reality of the crystal. Sophia didn't use shields. She draped one arm along the back of the sofa, her fingers toying idly with the stitching, her body angled toward me. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes were alert, hunting. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was pressurized. "You're doing it again," she said softly. The ice in her glass clinked as she tilted it. "Doing what?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, professional. "Calculating," she replied. "I can see the gears turning. You're assessing the threat level. You're drafting 3 different exit strategies and a press release, just in case." "I'm a strategist, Sophia. It's what you pay me for." "I pay you to strategize for the company," she corrected, her voice dropping an octave, slipping under my defenses. "I'm asking why you do it for yourself. Why do you hide?" The question felt like a physical blow, precise and targeted. I stiffened. "I don't hide. I operate from a position of tactical advantage. Visibility creates liability." "Spoken like a true press secretary," she teased, but there was no humor in her eyes. "But we aren't in a press briefing. We're in my living room, drinking my 18-year-old scotch, and you're reciting the employee handbook." She took a sip, watching me over the rim of her glass. "I've watched you for 5 years. You stand in the back of every photo. You edit your name out of the reports before they hit my desk. You make yourself invisible. Most people in this city would kill for a fraction of the spotlight you actively dodge. Is it fear?" "It's perspective," I countered, my grip on the glass tightening. "The person in the spotlight is the person who gets blinded. I prefer to see what's coming." "And what do you see coming right now?" "A conversation that crosses professional boundaries," I said, trying to reestablish the line she was so casually erasing. Sophia laughed, a soft, dry sound. "The boundaries washed away about 20 minutes ago on the balcony. Don't pretend you didn't feel the shift." She leaned forward, reducing the distance between us by mere inches, yet the change in atmospheric pressure was immense. "You talk about strategy, about perspective, but that's just the facade. It's the marble cladding on a building with a condemned foundation." The architectural metaphor hit close to home. She knew exactly which buttons to press. "You think I'm unstable?" I asked, a flash of genuine irritation pricking through the velvet silence. "I think you're terrified," she said, her voice devoid of judgment, stating it as a simple fact, like the weather or the stock price. "You build these walls, this silence, this efficiency, because you're afraid of what happens if you actually let someone inside. You treat your own life like a crisis that needs to be managed instead of lived." I opened my mouth to argue, to throw more jargon at her, to talk about risk mitigation and asset protection, but the words died in my throat. She was looking at me with that unflinching gaze, the one that stripped away the title and the suit and left only the woman underneath. There was no aggression in her look, only a terrifying curiosity. She wasn't trying to break me. She was trying to understand how I was built. The silence stretched, heavy and sultry, filled only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't since I was a child. My carefully constructed persona, the fixer, the ghost, was dissolving under the heat of her attention. I wanted to look away, to study the ice in my drink, to check my phone, anything to break the connection. But I couldn't. Her gaze held me pinned to the leather, breathless and waiting. "I'm not afraid of living," I finally whispered, the confession slipping out before I could vet it. I'm afraid of the cost. Sophia watched me for a long beat, her expression softening into something unreadable. She didn't press for clarification. She didn't have to. She understood the cost better than anyone. She finished her drink in one smooth swallow and set the glass down on the coffee table with a decisive click. Then she stood up. The movement was fluid, graceful, the motion of a woman who owned the space around her. She didn't walk toward the door. She turned and walked to the massive floor-to-ceiling window, her silhouette framed against the storm-battered city. She didn't look back. She just raised a hand, fingers curling in a silent, commanding gesture. "Come here," she said. "Look at this." I moved to join her. My legs felt heavy, not from the whiskey, but from the sheer gravitational pull of the moment. I walked across the plush rug, the silence trailing behind me like a heavy train, until I stood beside her. We weren't touching. There was a gap of maybe 6 inches between us, a demilitarized zone of charged air that felt denser than the rest of the room. We looked out at the city. It was a mess of smeared light and gray water. The storm had turned the skyline into a chaotic impressionist painting, blurring the hard steel edges of the skyscrapers until they looked like they were melting into the pavement. It was beautiful in a destructive, violent way. The world down there was drowning, chaotic, noisy. Up here, behind 3 inches of reinforced glass, it was just a silent light show. "It looks different from up here," I said quietly, my voice barely registering over the hum of the rain. "It looks small," Sophia corrected, her breath fogging the glass for a fleeting second. "When you're down there, in the traffic, in the noise, it feels overwhelming. It feels like it owns you. Up here, it's just a grid, a system. You can see where the lines break." I didn't look at the city. I looked at the glass. The night was dark enough outside that the window acted as a mirror, a black, glossy surface reflecting the ghost of the room behind us. The low, shadowy furniture, the empty crystal glasses catching the dim light. And I could see us. 2 women standing in the dark, stripped of the gala's noise. In the reflection, I didn't have to look her in the eye. I could study her without the risk of burning up on re-entry. I watched the way she held herself. Even now, relaxed, barefoot, she had the posture of a statue, a monument to endurance. Her chin was lifted, her shoulders back. But in the safety of the reflection, I saw something else. I saw the tension in her jaw, the way a muscle feathered there as she clenched her teeth. I saw a slight droop in the corner of her mouth, a shadow of fatigue that never appeared in the glossy press photos or the annual reports. "It must be lonely," I murmured, watching her reflection watch the storm. Being the only one who sees the grid. Sophia didn't blink. Her eyes in the glass were dark pools, unreadable. "It's a vacuum," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, a secret shared between the window pane and the rain. "Everyone thinks the top is a peak. They think it's a summit with a view. It's not. It's an airlock. You step inside, the door seals behind you, and suddenly you're breathing recycled air. Everyone outside is waving or screaming or throwing stones, but you can't hear them. You just see their mouths moving. You see the mechanics of their wants, but you don't feel the impact." She paused, and in the reflection, her eyes shifted. They slid away from the drowning city and met mine in the glass. "That's why I like you," she added, the words soft but heavy. "You don't wave, you don't scream. You just stand there, in the silence, waiting. You don't ask for air." The admission hit me in the center of my chest, cracking something vital. I had spent years curating my silence, thinking it was a shield, a way to stay invisible and safe. I thought I was hiding from her. But she hadn't seen the silence as a wall. She had seen it as a mirror. My velvet silence wasn't a defense against her glass fortress. It was the same architecture. We were both ghosts haunting different wings of the same castle, separated only by a floor plan I had been too afraid to read. "I thought if I was quiet enough," I confessed, speaking to her reflection, terrified to turn my head, "I wouldn't get caught in the machinery. I thought I was watching the show from the cheap seats." "You are the machinery," she said. The air in the room seemed to thicken, growing heavy and viscous. The rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass grew louder, a steady, hypnotic beat that matched the thudding pulse in my neck. The scent of the rain, that metallic, wet smell of a city being washed clean, seeped through the vents, mixing with the peat of the whiskey and the warm, sharp sandalwood of her skin. It was overwhelming. It was a sensory cage, and I had lost the key. "You know," she said, her voice shifting. The melancholy note evaporated, replaced by something sharper, something warmer. The vibration of it ran through the floorboards and up my bare legs. "The problem with watching the reflection is that it's backwards. You aren't seeing the real thing. You're seeing the reverse." She turned. It wasn't a sudden movement, but it felt violent in its finality. She turned away from the window, away from the city, and faced me directly. The gap between us seemed to vanish. She wasn't looking at the grid anymore. She wasn't looking at the storm. She was looking at me. The shift in her energy was palpable, a physical wave of heat. The tired executive, the lonely architect of industry, was gone. In her place was something else entirely. Her eyes were dark, dilated, locking onto mine with a focus that made my knees weak. A minute ago, we were sharing a moment of existential dread, two lonely souls staring into the abyss. Now she looked like she was contemplating whether to eat me or kiss me, and she hadn't quite decided which would be more fun. "Tell me," she whispered, stepping closer, infringing on the 6 inches of safety I had left, her breath warm against my cheek. "Are you still analyzing the risk? Or have you finally realized we're past the point of no return?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry despite the whiskey. "I stopped analyzing when you took off your shoes." A slow smile spread across her face. It wasn't the polite smile for the shareholders. It was predatory. It was playful. It was a promise. "Good," she breathed, her gaze dropping to my lips. "Because I'm done talking about architecture. You saved the acquisition, you know." Sophia's voice was quiet, lacking the sharp, percussive cadence she used in the boardroom. It was softer, rounder, like the whiskey settling in my stomach. She didn't move back to the window. She stayed right there in my personal space, holding my gaze with a terrifying steadiness. "I just did the due diligence," I replied, the automatic deflection coming to my lips out of habit. "The legal team missed the zoning issue in the warehouse district. I just caught it." "You didn't just catch it," she corrected, tilting her head slightly, studying me as if I were a complex schematic she was trying to decipher. "You anticipated it. You saw the fracture lines before the stress was even applied. Everyone else was looking at the profit margins, but you were looking at the foundation." She took a half step closer, and the air between us seemed to compress, becoming dense and hard to breathe. "That's why I keep you close. You see the things I don't." "I'm paid to be paranoid," I said, my voice sounding thinner than I wanted it to. "It's part of the job description." "Is it?" She swirled the remaining amber liquid in her glass, the ice clinking softly, a metronome counting down the seconds of my professional resolve. "Because I've read your job description. It says nothing about standing on a balcony in a hurricane to avoid a conversation. It says nothing about this wall you build." "Composure isn't a wall," I argued, though I could feel the bricks loosening. "It's a necessity. It's a mask," she countered gently. "And tonight, it's slipping." The conversation was drifting into dangerous territory. We were skirting the edge of something that wasn't covered in the employee handbook. This wasn't a performance review. It was a dismantling. Sophia wasn't asking about my quarterly goals. She was asking about the woman underneath the charcoal suit. And the terrifying part was that she seemed to like what she was seeing. "You have a stray hair," she whispered. It was such a mundane observation. In the office, she would have signaled an assistant to hand me a mirror. Here, in the dim amber light of the penthouse, it was a declaration of intent. She reached out. Time didn't stop. That's a cliche. But it certainly slowed down, dragging its feet through the thick, charged air. I watched her hand approach, her fingers long and elegant, stripped of rings, moving with that signature precision. My analytical mind, usually running 3 steps ahead, screeched to a halt. There was no strategy for this. There was no contingency plan for the CEO reaching out to touch you. Her fingertips grazed my temple, cool and dry against my flush skin. The sensation was electric, a shock that started at the point of contact and raced down my spine, blowing every fuse in my nervous system. She hooked the rogue lock of damp hair behind my ear, her thumb brushing the sensitive skin of my jawline. She didn't pull away. Her hand lingered there, cupping the side of my face, her thumb resting just beneath my pulse point. She had to feel it, the frantic, rabbit-kick rhythm of my heart battering against my skin. It was a betrayal of every cool, collected facade I had ever presented to her. I was exposed. I was vulnerable. And I was paralyzed. "You're trembling," she noted, her voice a low hum that I felt in my chest. "I'm not," I lied, but the breath shuddered out of me, proving her right. "You are," she insisted softly. Her eyes dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes, dark and dilated. Is it the cold? Or is it me? My internal monologue, usually a constant stream of risk assessment and data analysis, went silent. It was replaced by a roar of sensory input. The scent of her, warm skin, sandalwood, rain, and expensive scotch. The heat radiating from her body, inches from mine. The terrifying reality that the most powerful woman I knew was looking at me not as an asset, but as a desire. I should have stepped back. I should have made a joke, checked my watch, cited the late hour. I should have retreated to the safety of the velvet silence I had worn for 5 years. But the silence wasn't safe anymore. It was lonely. "I don't want to leave," I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. Sophia's eyes softened, the predatory edge melting into something warmer, something that looked dangerously like relief. Her thumb stroked my jawline once, a slow, deliberate caress that felt like a claim. "Good," she whispered, because I locked the door. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, sultry, and waiting for a spark. The space between us was no longer a gap. It was a live wire, humming with a voltage that threatened to burn the building down. Standing there, with her thumb tracing the line of my jaw, the world narrowed down to the heat of her skin and the scent of rain-soaked ozone. It was a precipice. One step forward and we would fall into something that couldn't be undone. The employee handbook didn't have a chapter for this. The board of directors couldn't vote on the way her breath hitched when I didn't pull away. Sophia's eyes were dark, searching mine with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "You think you're the only one who watches?" she whispered. The question hung in the air, heavy and sweet. "You think I don't notice the way you stand in the back of the room? The way you rewrite the press releases so I sound human? The way you look at me when you think I'm busy with the shareholders?" "I thought I was invisible," I managed to say, though my voice was barely a ghost of itself. I made sure I was. "You've never been invisible to me," she countered, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated through my bones. "You're the only thing in the room that feels real." She leaned in. It wasn't a sudden move. It was a gravitational shift. Her face was inches from mine. I could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, the faint, jagged pulse beating at the base of her throat. She was terrified. The realization crashed into me with the force of the storm outside. Sophia, the unflinching architect of industry, was scared. She was risking everything, the reputation, the hierarchy, the carefully constructed glass fortress, for this, for me. My hands, acting on their own accord, lifted to rest on her waist. The silk of her dress was cool, but the skin beneath it was burning. I felt her sharp intake of breath, a sound that shattered the last of my professional resolve. We were on the edge. The air was thick, charged with 5 years of silence and stolen glances. Her gaze dropped to my mouth again, and this time it didn't leave. Her eyelids fluttered shut. She tilted her head, the movement agonizingly slow. I leaned forward, the distance closed to nothing. I could feel the warmth of her breath on my lips, tasting of whiskey and anticipation. The world dissolved into static. Bzz. The sound was sharp, ugly, and jarring. Sophia's phone, lying face down on the marble coffee table, vibrated violently against the stone. It was a summons from the real world, a reminder that we were CEO and subordinate, that there were shareholders and drivers and schedules waiting outside this amber-lit bubble. I flinched, pulling back half an inch. The spell cracked. The heavy, sultry tension splintered. Sophia didn't move. She didn't check the phone. She didn't even blink. She just kept her eyes locked on mine, her hands still cupping my face, refusing to let the moment die. "Ignore it," she commanded, her voice rough. "It might be important," I whispered, though the words felt like ash in my mouth. "It might be the driver. He's been waiting downstairs for hours." A slow, secret smile touched her lips. It wasn't the predator's smile anymore. It was the smile of someone who had already won the game. "It's not the driver," she said softly. "I sent him away an hour ago." The words took a second to land. When they did, the floor seemed to drop out from under me. "You... what?" "I told him to go," she repeated, her thumb brushing my cheekbone again. "I told him I wouldn't be needing the car tonight. Before you came out to the balcony. Before the rain even started." My mind reeled. The storm hadn't trapped us. The weather was just a convenient accomplice. She had planned this. She had cleared the board, removed the pieces, and created this vacuum of silence specifically for us. "You knew," I breathed. "You knew I wouldn't leave." "I hoped," she corrected, and the vulnerability in her voice was the most dangerous thing yet. "I hoped you were tired of the silence, too." The power dynamic flipped in an instant. She wasn't holding me captive with her authority. She was asking me to stay with her desire. I realized, with a jolt of pure adrenaline, that I wasn't just the fixer. I was the one thing she couldn't fix, the one variable she couldn't control. And she was terrified I would walk away. Outside, the thunder rolled, but it was distant now. The violent drumming against the glass began to slow, fading into a steady, rhythmic drizzle. The storm was breaking. The chaos that had justified this insanity was passing, leaving us stranded in the quiet aftermath. The excuse of the weather was evaporating. Now, there was only the choice. "Sophia," I said, her name feeling illicit and heavy on my tongue. "Don't," she whispered, leaning her forehead against mine. "Don't analyze it. Just be here." The storm finally broke, exhaling its last violent breath against the glass. The silence that followed wasn't the heavy, pressurized quiet of the last hour. It was the silence of aftermath. The city lights below, previously smeared by the deluge, began to sharpen into focus, reasserting their grid, their logic. The world was waking up from its suspension, demanding we return to our assigned places. I stepped back. It required a physical effort, a tearing of gravity. Sophia didn't stop me. She let her hand fall from my face, her fingertips trailing a ghost of heat across my cheekbone before dropping to her side. She understood the architecture of the moment. We had pushed the structure to its load-bearing limit. Anything more, and the whole thing would collapse into something we couldn't walk away from. Retrieving my coat felt like putting on a costume that no longer fit. The wool was heavy, scratchy, a dull armor against a world I no longer cared about. I fumbled with the buttons, my fingers numb, not from cold, but from the sudden absence of her proximity. My movements were slow, reluctant, fighting the urge to drop the coat and return to the blue leather sofa. Sophia stood by the marble island, leaning against the stone, watching me. She didn't offer to call a car. She didn't offer a polite executive dismissal. She just watched, her dark eyes cataloging every hesitation, every glance I threw back at her. The walk to the private elevator was short, but the air in the hallway felt different. It was no longer the sterile vacuum of the penthouse. It was intimate. We walked side by side, not touching, but the space between us was alive. The sound of our footsteps on the plush runner was synchronized, a rhythm that suggested we had been walking in step for years. The silence wasn't awkward. It was complicit. We were co-conspirators in a crime that hadn't quite been committed yet, but the intent was signed, sealed, and delivered. She pressed the call button. The light glowed soft white. When the door slid open, revealing the mirrored interior, I hesitated. This was the border. This was the checkpoint. Sophia didn't say goodbye. She didn't offer a platitude about seeing me in the office on Monday. She looked at me, her expression stripping away the last of the fixer persona I tried to rally. "Good night," she said. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a wait. It was a word that carried the heavy, sultry promise of continuity. It implied that the night wasn't ending, only pausing. "Good night, Sophia," I whispered. The door slid shut, severing the sight of her standing barefoot on the polished concrete. I was alone. I leaned back against the cold metal wall of the elevator, the chill seeping through my coat, trying to ground myself. But it was impossible. My skin still burned with the phantom sensation of her touch. The smell of sandalwood and rain was trapped in the elevator with me. Or maybe it was just trapped in my lungs. I watched the floor numbers tick down. I closed my eyes, replaying the last hour on a loop. The way she kicked off her heels, the way the whiskey tasted on her breath. With every floor, I was descending back into the velvet silence I had spent 5 years perfecting. But as the numbers blurred, I realized the truth. The velvet was ruined. You can't go back to the comfort of the shadows once you've stared directly into the sun. The silence wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was just an empty room, waiting for her to walk into it. I wasn't the strategist in the background anymore. I was the variable in the equation. The elevator chimed. The lobby was empty, the night concierge nodding sleepily as I walked past, completely unaware that the woman passing him had been fundamentally rewired 40 floors up. I pushed through the revolving doors into the cool, damp night. The rain had reduced to a fine silver mist that clung to the pavement. I took a breath, the cold air filling my chest, but it couldn't cool the heat still radiating under my skin. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a single sharp vibration against my hip. I pulled it out, the screen glowing bright in the darkness, illuminating the mist. New calendar, invitation from Sophia. There was no subject line, just a code name we had used for the merger. Project Zenith. The location wasn't the office. It was a suite number at the hotel across town. Time, now. I stared at the screen, a smile touching my lips. The observer was gone. The participant had arrived. If you understand the weight of a silence like that, subscribe.